I've been a professional futurist for almost a decade, and it's a really unlikely beginning when you consider that I used to be afraid of the future. So, about 15 years ago, my sister asked me to go to see a tarot card reader with her. And I did everything I could to talk her out of it. I said it's a bad idea. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. What I didn't say is that I was scared. I'm not saying that I believe. What I am saying is that what if they told her something she didn't want to know? You can't unring that bell. Of course, she said I was overreacting. It was no big deal, that she didn't actually believe in such things. And she was right. We were having a great time as a tarot card reader flipped over one card at a time. But everything changed the moment they turned over the death card. My non-believing sister turned into a believer instantly. She was certain it was an omen of bad things to come. I spent the rest of the day, the rest of the week, the rest of the month convincing her that she would be fine. And all these years later, she is fine. But I went so far as to say, good, bad, or indifferent, I would never want to know what the future held. And I think this feeling is fairly common. Lots of people are afraid of the future. We're fundamentally afraid of the future because it's something that we can't control. Many of us believe that it's a mystery and therefore best left unexplored. But in practical terms, if it's either personally or professionally, this is something, a mandate that we can't stick with. You have to think about the future in meaningful ways. And I would dare say that each and every one of you do this. I mean, today when you decided to come to this event, you were trying to predict the future. You were predicting whether you'd be available, whether the weather would be in your favor, whether you'd have the time, whether it would be worth your interest, that it would deliver on the time that you invested. So we are always thinking about the future. We just don't think about it in those terms. And so ultimately, my job as a futurist isn't to predict the future. It's to slow down the conversation long enough to say, what are the underlying assumptions that you're basing your plan on? And what happens if those assumptions turn out to be wrong? In other words, what if everything you believe turns out to be false? So if you want to think like a futurist, you not only can't be afraid of the future, you have to begin by exploring the things you can't influence or control. I mean, when you're in a business organization, oftentimes when people want to think about the future, they rely on things that are most comfortable, most familiar. But we live in a world that has influences that we will never be able to bear upon in terms of our influence or our desires. So we have social, technological, economic, environmental, and political arenas that are constantly shaping the landscape of the world we live in today and the world we'll live into the future. Now, we'll never know exactly what the future holds, but if you concentrate on these 5 big themes, then you're certain to kind of entertain every possibility, or at least think about them in terms of the categories that should be included in your analysis. Organizations that spend a lot of time thinking about the future tend to like historical data. They look at a trend analysis to try to see where are the patterns and use it as a predictive model of things that might come. And when you do that, if you're in an organization that's risk averse and you see this detailed Excel spreadsheet or a beautifully crafted chart, people will look at it and say, well, someone's obviously spent a lot of time in this, and they'll give you a false sense of confidence. And so this precision is something that we tend to cling to. But time and time again, precision turns out to be generally wrong. What I want you to do is embrace ideas about the future that have absolutely no precision at all. They're fundamentally flawed, they're qualitative, they're subjective in nature. But time and time again, they turn out to be generally right. So when you're in an organization, you might look at a sales track. But the problem is that we live in a times where there's unprecedented innovation. We're faced with events that are new to history. And so there's no analysis, no look in a rearview mirror that would ever show the impact of the internet, the proliferation of cell phone technology, decoding the sequencing of the human genome. These are all things that a historical view will never help you prepare for the future. If you're going to think like a futurist, though, if you want to understand what the future holds, you have to be bold, you have to be courageous, you have to be provocative. You want to push the boundaries of what's possible. One way to start doing that is to look at wildcard analysis. So wildcard analysis are things that have a very low probability of occurring, but have a high probability of changing the human condition when they happen. So some illustrations of things that have happened in the past that would be good wildcard analysis. 9/11, the earthquake and tsunami that devastated Japan. There was the volcano that erupted over Iceland that disrupted air travel in Europe some years ago. And then even before that, we saw the rapid spread of the H1N1 virus, the swine flu, that gave rise to concerns over a global pandemic. If you were to look at each of these events individually in isolation, you would say that they seemingly caught the world by surprise, but I'm not sure why. For instance, Japan is geographically vulnerable to earthquakes. And so the fact that they had one should not have surprised anyone. What really was the big surprise is that no one outside of Japan had given it much thought. Indeed, the government of Japan had put a lot of time and energy into it. They had a lot of regulations, rigor, governance to mitigate the damage. But countries like the US, companies here, still continue to feel the ripple effect 3 years later because they didn't give any thought about what would happen if Japan had some sort of natural disaster that would disrupt communication, that would impair their access to natural resources, manufacturing processes, critical components. And the beauty about wildcard analysis is that sometimes when you start to imagine these different disasters could happen, the implications are fairly common. There are things like shoring up cash, making sure you have open lines of communication, having a system in place, a protocol so that people know how to reach the loved ones. So all you need to do is think about one or two bad things, and you'll have figured out how you would respond to multiple different things. So think about ready.gov. How many people here have ever gone to the website? Just a handful of people. And with the daily warnings that we have, it's shocking that we still don't take these measures. Again, it gets back to this idea that people don't like to think about the things that they can't control or influence. But these wildcard analysis, they're not all bad things. They could be wonderful, exciting things. Twitter is a major disruptor. Facebook is also a wildcard event. Facebook has so many members today, if it were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world. Those things are unprecedented and they change the way that we live. But if you want people to engage in this conversation with you, it's a fine line. Because while you want to be provocative and you want to push the boundaries of what's plausible, what's provocative, you have to stay within the realm of what's plausible. Years ago, when I started doing futuring work for Ford Motor Company, one of my colleagues went into a room and she loved to mix things up. And she started by saying, I just ran across this article that said 500,000 years from now, the male species will be extinct. It was certainly provocative, but she's just lost half of the room, all of the men in the room going, who invited her? And how can we make sure that she's never invited again? So when you engage in this, it is a fine line. You need to understand how willing is your audience, how far are they willing to go? What's their appetite in pushing the possibilities? The way that you can do this is to look at trends, global trends that are happening around the world. Now, trends mean different things to different people. For my professional work, what I'm looking for are things that are slow moving, things that manifest a shift in a deep-rooted value, attitude, or behavior. And the way that I always talk about this is blue jeans. Blue jeans have been around for 150 years. And if it were the 1900s and I was standing in front of you in a pair of blue jeans, I would probably be associated with a lower social economic class because blue jeans were the uniform of laborers. They were low cost, highly durable, very utilitarian. But today, 100 years later, they're high fashion. People will spend hundreds of dollars on a single pair of jeans. You can wear them to the office, the finest restaurants. And that means society's values, their attitudes and their behavior towards denim have changed. Now, by contrast, styles of denim, high-rise, low-rise, boot cut, skinny leg, acid wash, for those of you who remember the 80s, these are fads, and these are things that change with the season. And the real trick to doing futuring work is to separate a fad from a trend. Because most times fads move so quickly that by the time you're ready to act on them, they're long gone. So the next tip I have for you is that no one can predict the future. Anyone who tells you otherwise, you should be very wary of. But when you want to try to anticipate the unexpected, you should imagine the widest spectrum of possibilities that can come to mind. So if you write a story that has rose-colored glasses, a view of global economic prosperity with a happily ever after ending in it, then you need to pair it with a future that's dark and grim, economic collapse with despair and hopelessness and how things plan out. And you want to think about how that affects society as a whole. And if you can understand those two ends of the spectrum, then you're relatively prepared for anything that happens in between. Now, one of the things I did in work is that we looked at a scenario that actually explored the collapse of the automotive industry 4 years before it actually happened. Now, when we did this, we were never trying to predict the future. We were just trying to understand what are the possibilities. We also entertained a very short scenario about what if aliens landed and religion as we know it collapsed and the social infrastructure was no longer available. Now, nobody in the room thought that these were equally plausible possibilities, but the power of futuring comes from trying to imagine things that are outside the realm of what's comfortable, letting go of your biases, your prejudices, and your worldviews. And if you do this with a lot of discipline and rigor, invariably, you're going to run into things that actually play out. It's just really a numbers game. So my final tip for those who want to engage in the exploration of the future is to remember that no one can predict the future, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And when you are ready to try, I wanted to tee up a couple thoughts to get you started. So I often look at demographics because demographers will tell you that demography is destiny, that these numbers will tell you what the world will look like. So I want you to contemplate for a minute the global population. It's 7 billion people. This is a really big deal. The world has never known a population so dense. And in our lifetime, that number is going to grow to 9, 10. Some people even say 11 billion people by the year 2050. This should raise some alarming questions to all of you. I mean, first and foremost is, can a planet sustain a population of that size? I mean, we have no history to know for sure. One biologist based out of Harvard, E.O. Wilson, says we have nothing to worry about. There are 3.5 billion acres of land, and that's more than enough to feed a population that gets to 10 billion people. But on one condition, each and every one of us would have to become a vegetarian. So in other words, we can feed 2.5 billion omnivores or 10.5 billion vegetarians. And so if I add my what if lens to that, I wonder, does that mean in the future we might see a world war over beef, as some countries are willing to participate in the global sacrifice and others are not? Now, the reason we, the Westerners, the rich world, advanced economies, don't tend to notice that the population is getting bigger is because the growth is happening in parts of the world that are least capable of handling it. In fact, the markets that we sell to, the United States is one of many countries that have declining fertility. In fact, in the 1970s, every woman gave birth to about 5 children on average. Today, the global average is 2. The United States is slightly below that. Another way to think about that is that we're below replenishment rate. We're not having enough babies to offset the deaths. And as a result, our size is shrinking. Now, in the United States, we're unique from some other countries because we have a heavy level of immigration, so that keeps our population rather stable. But as a byproduct of this, the people that do live here are aging rapidly. Now, this is just a numbers game. I mean, think about the fact that if you're not having enough babies to offset the death, the average age of the citizens are getting older and older. One scientist has declared that by, 2050, there will be millions of centenarians around the world, people that live to be over 100 years of age. In fact, many scientists believe that the first people to live to be 150 years of age have already been born. So look to the person to your right or your left. One of you could live for 1.5 centuries. Now, this is a really big deal. That's a really big deal. Such a big deal that the United Nations has actually declared that the aging population worldwide will be the greatest social and economic challenge that we face in our lifetime. Social standpoint is, who's going to stay around to take care of the elderly? When you think about how upwardly mobile societies become, the workforce, students, I mean, I imagine in this room there are a handful of you that aren't even from Michigan, certainly even more of you that don't plan to stay in Michigan when you graduate. Who will stay behind to tend to your parents' needs, your grandparents' needs? The real heart of the issue, though, comes down to the economics, and this is what economists refer to as a dependency ratio. How many workers do you have supporting your non-working population? By the year 2050, Japan will be upside down. They're the oldest country in terms of percentage, and by 2050, they'll have 108 retirees supported by 100 workers. This means their economic output will slow down. Their GDP will drop. Their famously high savings rate will start to erode. leaving less money for innovation and investment. And over time, it'll steal Japan of its technological prominence, its political sphere of influence, its social clout. Where is it likely to migrate to? Many people think China and India are good possibilities. These two markets are highly touted ever since Goldman Sachs came up with the BRIC acronym in 2002. So Goldman Sachs was asked the question, what are the markets that have the greatest opportunity for growth in the future? And they said Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Let's just talk briefly about these two. China is one of the most rapidly aging populations in the world because they have this social engineering where they're trying to control their population. Many of us are familiar with the one-child policy. Every child born into China is born into what's known as the 4-2-1 dilemma. This means that they will be financially responsible for 2 parents and 4 aging grandparents. In other words, informally, their dependency ratio is 6-1. It's not sustainable. India, however, is interesting because they are an exception to almost everything I just told you. They're one of the youngest populations in the world. When Japan's at 108 retirees to every 100 workers, India will be at 24 retirees for every 100 workers. It's known as a demographic dividend and could translate into a great economic boom for them, but only if they can find ways to meaningfully educate and employ the masses. One thing that might change all of this, though, is women. Women are gaining new prominence worldwide. They're entering new domains, new frontiers. We have a long way to go. We make up 50% of the population. But when you look at Forbes' list of most influential people, women only comprise 12% of that list. And if you look at the number of billionaires worldwide, women only make 10% of the billionaire list. But there is hope, girls. By the year 2050, one expert has claimed that there'll be more female billionaires than male billionaires. But before I ruffle the feathers of the men in the room, take comfort in knowing that you will still dominate in the millionaire ranks, and that's a much larger pool. But what are the drivers behind this? The drivers are advances in education. Girls are getting greater access to education, which leads to greater financial independence and career opportunities. No longer is marriage seen as part of the equation for long-term financial security. This explains why in many developed countries you have more single people than married people. Here in the US, we have more female students at the country's best universities and colleges. Harvard, Yale, Columbia have more female students. And across the board, if you look at the achievement of bachelor's, master's, and PhDs, girls outnumber boys in every single category. So when I talk about these trends, I tend to make some of the people uncomfortable. But the future's not written in stone. There is really no such thing as fate or destiny. You create those things on your own. The only way that you'll ever achieve the destiny of your greatest desires is to think meaningfully about the future. And that's where I hope you begin. Thank you.